Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal. Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores. Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Restauração do Museu Nacional ou da Cripta da Basílica de Nazaré. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. A cultura brasileira tem o nosso apoio. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Mobilidade é vida. Somos a CCR. Estamos presentes em 13 estados brasileiros e em outros 3 países. Unidos por um único propósito: melhorar a vida das pessoas através da mobilidade. A inovação sustentável nos aponta a direção, as necessidades de nossos clientes, as oportunidades. Valorizamos os encontros, valorizamos a vida.
Caixa, o banco com milhões de clientes que sempre tem um olhar especial para quem mais importa: você. É por você que tem nos benefícios sociais a esperança para superar os desafios. É por você que tem direito à moradia digna e quer realizar o sonho da casa própria. É por um país que acredita na união e reconstrução, com mais diversidade, sustentabilidade e muitas oportunidades. Caixa, é por você, é por um novo Brasil.
Sou mediadora de leitura, trabalho com literatura, contação de história. Vou falar desde 2015, na cidade de Paraty. Já trabalhava com isso antes, na cidade do Rio. E tenho 47 anos hoje. E sempre tive uma atividade muito voltada à literatura com crianças, principalmente em bibliotecas comunitárias. Então eu vejo cada vez mais uma Paraty que vem se transformando e modificando, como o Brasil também, né? Que está mudando um pouco a cultura de como tratar o livro, o que é o objeto livro, o que é leitura, o que é literatura e a transformação disso. Eu vejo que a Flip, como evento, ele é um evento que vem transformando muito os jovens, as crianças. É muito interessante ver aqueles que eram pequenininhos há 10 anos atrás e hoje estão com 20, 22 e falam assim: eu li aquele livro, lembra que a gente escreveu? Lembra que você participou? E eles estão mudando o ponto de vista deles e passando isso para os filhos. Então eu vejo que a Flip, nos últimos 20 anos, e eu espero que nos próximos 20, 30, 40, 60, 100 anos, transforme em mentes. E que essas mentes transformadas transformem o ambiente. Não só transformando, lendo para os filhos, que é super importante, acho que tem que acontecer, mas transformando para todos que estão à sua volta. Um Brasil que entenda, uma Paraty que entenda que sem essa leitura, sem essa literatura, seja ela em papel, WhatsApp, PDF, sem isso a gente não vai conseguir andar mais os 20 anos, a gente vai passar 20 anos parado. E mais 20 anos parado, ou andando para trás, que nem algum tempo atrás a gente fez, não vale a pena.
Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade. Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 21ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 231427, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiência física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú, CCR e Caixa. Patrocínio Prata, O Globo, Mac Imóveis e Sebrae. Patrocínio Bronze, Globo Livros e Eletronuclear. Parceria institucional SESC. Prefeitura de Paraty, Embratur e Museu do Território. É uma concepção, Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Hello, good evening. I am Fernanda Bastos, thank you. And along with Brito, I am one of the curators of FLIP this year. And I would like to greet all of you who are here. And it is a pleasure to welcome the authors that will bring together Mozambique and Brazil. We will be guided in this journey by Nanni Rios, editor and journalist, and she will conduct this conversation between Manuel Mutimucuio and Tatiana Pequeno. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. To talk about these interesting subjects that these two authors are capable of presenting to us, I would like to thank Flip for the invitation to be mediating another roundtable. Thank you, Fernando and Milena. It's such a pleasure to be here in another Flippy. Thank you also all of you who are here attending. And thank you, Tatiana and Manuel, for having made this wonderful work. After the roundtable, they will be signing their work at the bookshop. So I would like to start. We decided to do initial reading so that you can better understand, and we'll just make a brief introduction of each one of the authors, and then you will know a little bit about their work. So Manuel Mutimucuio was born in Maputo in Mozambique, and he studied in Beira. He has a PhD in governance and political economies at the University of Coimbra, and he's international consultant of natural resource management. His literary work will go through that kind of topic, social analysis, and different status quo questioning. So thank you for being here. Felipe Tatiana Pequeno was born in Rio de Janeiro. She's graduated in literature, and she's a professor of Brazilian literature at UFI. She has 5 books published, which are Réplica das Ortigas from 2009, Aceno from 2014, Where Are the Bombs? Onde Estão as Bombas? Tocar o Terror, 2022, and the book that is being launched here at Flip, which is Teoria da Ressecção. And so she might talk about her most recent launch. So, having introduced, I will ask each one of you to read an excerpt from your book. Let's allow Manuel to start, please.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon. It's afternoon here, right? Good afternoon, everyone. Many people in the audience at the taxi stop had not followed the speech, even in spoken or written. It was too fast for their reading abilities, but no one doubted that the president had made an important announcement. English was now the country's new official language. Somebody broke the silence. This president has decided now Mozambique is going to be developed. The person said with great help. Mozambique, not Mozambique. Another person in the audience corrected the first. The taxis, there was no other topic. Everyone had strong opinions on the subject, and they wanted to voice them. The driver, using the authority that his position gave him, turned the radio off that was competing for the space with the newscasters to make himself heard. Mozambicans are fools. He stopped to check if he could drown out the other people. Haven't you realized that this law is just to benefit the president himself? He added and took another pause. When he realized that the passengers were anxious to know how the law benefited the president personally, the driver continued, have you never noticed that the president speaks Portuguese with a foreign accent? He seems like he's white when he speaks English. He's like a white man too. Brothers, what he's doing is turning the roles upside down. Now we are going to feel like foreigners in our own land. There were certainly a few who began to see the merits of the driver's arguments, but many others also had their own opinions. They say the president is from Inhambane, but this man is right when he says he doesn't sound like he's from Inhambane or from Xingondo. He's like a Boer. An African, said a woman. Mozambique never develops because of people like you. The president has never hidden that he studied abroad. People voted him exactly for that reason, for him to do here in our country what he saw elsewhere. Another woman said, not having been convinced by the driver. Olo stayed silent throughout the trip. He was interested in listening to the opinions of other passengers, but he also spent most of his time thinking to himself if he wasn't to blame for everything that was happening. He wondered if it had been a good idea to take inspiration from his boss, Jassy, struggling to speak Portuguese without his teeth touching his tongue, or if he had not had the wisdom to look at life from hindsight. He would have chosen a more visionary idol, and perhaps now, rather than regretting, he would be preparing his English lesson to help the Portuguese teacher to keep her job. When he got home, he threw his briefcase on the bed, and suddenly he felt disoriented. The reasons that he wanted to reach there so quickly did not seem so obvious. In his uncertainty, resigned to the fatigue of a day full of surprises, and using his own feet, he knocked his shoes off opened the buttons on his shirt, and turned his head as if it were his trousers made the company to his shoes on the floor. Next, he unloosed the mosquito net and laid under the mosquito net. The room seemed too hot. He turned the blanket down, then the sheets, but he couldn't find a comfortable position to sleep. He remembered that he hadn't eaten anything since he'd left work. His hunger was behind his inability to fall asleep, but he didn't feel like eating. He hadn't bathed either. It could have been a factor. Aware that he had not bathed since he'd left in the morning because of Sakina's incompetence, he got out of bed and took 2 fingers. He tried to grab a bottle of water which was stuck to the ground. There was water in it, but since he was very hot, he didn't need to turn the heat on to take a bath. Using the only window in his house, he looked out to the outhouse. There were no neighbors around, and therefore no neighbors were around the outhouse. He took a bucket, a black bucket which had soap and pumice to clean his feet. He walked towards the outhouse. The lamp had been burned, and he had to be content with the moonlight like he did in Ningiza. The sand was soaked. The dirty water came up over his sandals. That situation irritated him, but he was powerless given the reality of a tiny outhouse that served the 7 families in the tenement. He put the bucket on the brick, and as an acrobat, he left the outhouse without stepping on the soaked ground. He used the same skill to cross the sandy ground and went back to his bedroom, and he remembered his purpose. He turned the box over where he kept his books, his booklets, exams, and other documents from his school, looking for his English lessons. He leafed through a notebook and looked at his exams and concluded that Mozambique would be a very difficult country for him. It occurred to him an idea that reminded him of his homeland. The people in Diza had seen the decisions by the parliament. It was unlikely. Could the president of the republic had they heard the president speak? Perhaps. He thought of his mother. If he, as the son, was used to life in the city, he feared the future. He couldn't imagine the suffering that she had would go through if she was forced to learn a new language at 55 years. He remembered later that his Portuguese teacher had said that only Portuguese had been limited. His mother only spoke Xangana, the little Portuguese that she had learned in the colonial times. She had unlearned as soon as the Portuguese had left Mozambique. The old woman seemed to be several decades ahead of the president of Mozambique. Resolved that family issue, another name came to mind, was the store owner, Manuel. Would the grocery store owner serve his customers in English? He couldn't rule that hypothesis out because Manuel had never learned Portuguese, but having worked throughout his youth in the mines in South Africa, he knew a few words in English. Now, perhaps with permission from Maputo, the capital, he would be capable of making full sentences in English. Finally, he thought of the rest of the village. Almost no one spoke Portuguese, and it wouldn't be surprising if nobody missed a language that they'd never even understood, and they'd perhaps always despised. Around there, people always felt closer to South Africa, and they were capable of celebrating the decision to declare English as the country's official language. Thank you very much. So, reading Mozambique with Z from cross-eyed Mozambique as Mozambique. What women can teach about poetry? Nothing if the men are deaf. They're like ships anchored without another possible map for deep oceanic navigations. Women are like voices that cry out in solitude in the desert. They're stones forgotten in each solitude. They are surrounded by prophets, professors, PhDs, who never were willing to lose a scrap of the thick, powerful fabric that protects them on Earth. Yes, it's true that we all suffer here, but we sit back waiting someplace in the long lines of integrity, or we have our faces shaken by the primeval ease of animal men, or we weep defeated with our clotted blood under the fingernails of one or two children that we've lost in our short lives and prevented from being raised by us. We are left with our beds at our feet, drying the torrential fever of the geniuses. We've never asked men to read my poems, but I always left an open breast for in case one suffers from love. Men could go silent a little bit more, give in the poetic art of listening, although they're all avid for technology, the Olympian technology of the ancients. They forged all the iron or copper in their joy of the hangmen who tattoo our skins, the scarlet letters, silencing with the death sentence or torture. Our men reproach us with our faces, waste words. They rub their closed flies against our tongues, and we dry our eyes on the embroidery stained with ingratitude and abandonment. I know not a single woman who has not had some skin stolen by silence, the continuous repose of writing and speech with systematic gestures, systematic out of fear. For 20 years, I've been waiting for your telephone call. For 15 years, I've been waiting for you to pick up the vestiges of your mother. For 32 years, I remembered that you never came back again. For 2 months, I want to ignore that you shouted in that meeting and no one prevented you from continuing. For 5 hours, I've heard your authoritarian tone demanding my presence. I'm alive, but I don't know until which corner of town.
Tatiana leu poema do Tocar.
So she read a poem from Tocar o Terror, Raising Hell in a free translation. So I asked him to read so that we were able to maybe have a hint, even those that did not read it, to hear their accents, the way they speak, with the Portuguese or Portugueses under which they travel and journey. To my pleasure today, they identified these differences too. So how about, feeling a stranger to Portuguese? What kind of Portuguese is this? This agreement that no one has agreed upon, and this way of talking and speaking that will, in some way or the other, uniting us, but also separating us, as some people understand each other, as they don't. So there's so strange words that come up in Manuel's literature, maybe it a dialect or what have you, or just different meanings to the same words. Mozambique here or in Portugal. I would like you to please talk about this estrangement that our mother tongue brings to us when we read our language, our own language. Thank you, Nanni. This whole thing about calling this a mother tongue is a bit difficult in Mozambique, especially because there are people like myself that are unable to say what is one's mother tongue. In this context, I was once in a context in which my parents will talk a language which is their mother tongue, but they did not speak to us in that same language with us children. They would speak and address us in Portuguese. But to say that Portuguese is my mother tongue, I would probably offend my parents. In the rural areas where most of the Mozambican population lives, just for your information, in Mozambique we have something around 20, 30 different languages. And people will speak each one of these 30 languages as their first language, and some, or most, will speak more than one language. And this I'm too referring to the African languages, native language, original languages. They will speak 1, 2, 3, even 4 languages. You have Mozambicans that will speak 6, 7 languages. So to ask them what is the mother tongue is complicated. And then we have the issue of Portuguese language itself. It's true that in the case of Mozambique, before it being a language that we use to express ourselves, it is a political project. Before the independence of Mozambique, when we started seeing the Mozambican nationalist movement, our leaders, the politicians at that time, had a debate that has not yet been concluded if it would make sense to adopt the language belonging to the colonizer. One of the worst crises in terms of our colonial freedom in Mozambique, when our nationalists were unearthed, so to speak. In Dar es Salaam, they were in exile. There was this institute that was created to start preparing the new Mozambicans that would be spearheading the country. And everything was taught in Portuguese, and there was much resistance. First, they were in a country that was it was Swahili, and they spoke English. And why they were fighting an enemy, because enemy was also something difficult to understand. And at the same time, they were adopting that same language, a language spoken by the enemy. So why am I telling this story? The truth is that Mozambique will become independent in 1975. And at that time, just a handful of Mozambicans would speak Portuguese. So once again, Mozambique could have, at that time, because Portuguese was not the dominant language, they could at that time have decided to democratize the language. But this is the political sense that goes beyond the discussion that came from Dar es Salaam, from Tanzania. This territory that I have here on my T-shirt that we call Mozambique is not a single territory. Each one of these languages, if we are to consider the European sense of languages, each language is a nation, each language is a people. So the division of Africa in different parts ended up building this map and said, oh, now you're all Mozambicans. So we have to acknowledge that our politicians decided that Portuguese would be the official language of the country, and it would be the symbol of unity. And if you allow me another 30 seconds, it is a very strong unity symbol, but also a symbol of exclusion. And because today, in 2023, probably the language that, if we want to be a bit optimistic, it may be spoken by half the population. The other half the population does not speak Portuguese. And the half that does speak Portuguese is the half that has better access to information, to education. And the other half will not participate efficiently in all the construction process. These processes are all translated into a language that they do not know. Thank you. Well, well, I do ask myself these questions of how Portuguese as a language can be strange, and at the same time we're meshed in this language, and language that is supposedly our mother tongue. But thinking beyond it being mother tongue, we have to think about the language of poetry. What language is this through which I am able to constitute a possibility of surviving, a survival that will happen through poetry, a survival that was only made possible through some type of elaboration. So I believe that in my poetry, I end up seeing, I guess, Milena and what I guess this, they and Fernanda talked about this when they called us to participate in this roundtable. I'm interested in a language that will go beyond the mother tongue, also the familiar language. And I guess the poetic language is of that of amazement, of bewilderment. It is this language that will bring about some form of discomfort, at least for the things I write, the poetry I write. These things will be necessarily coming together with a sort of a different voices that come together. Because I have, for instance, a very academic education, extremely guided towards grammatics and writing, a very coordinated, well-structured way of what language is. So poetry gives me the possibility of occupying another space within this spectrum. And so there I'm interested in the language of our memory, and this will end up being seen in what I produce as a memory, something that is full of holes and it's cracks and it's fragmented, but this fragment is this attempt to elaborate something, and this attempt of preparing something. It's always a process. It's costly, it's long, it's hard, and it will allow us to, in a certain way, come together and reposition myself. And that is what is from a mother and father. So I guess the different voices that I have here in this poetry, in this work that also interests me as a researcher, as a professor, it's always a work that will produce some kind of clash, of friction between this linguistic approachability or previsibility of forecasting or the daily language. So the voices here are voices from my grandmother and from other women that went through some kind of violent experience, of the experience that in a certain way is seen in the poem I read. And regarding the previous roundtable with Monica Ojeda and Alana Portero talking about fear, cruelty, ferociousness, it's a bit this language that interests me too. It is this language that will therefore bring about some type of transgression to what is seen as something that is normative, and that regardless of the fact that poetry has its history of being something that is dreamlike, it is more sublime, it is a more diaphanous tradition, that does not interest me. And for instance, in Onde Estão as Bombas, Where are the Bombs, there is the language of the mammoths, of the elderly, of the ancients, of this heavy language of these hard, difficult people.
Acho que a gente está indo.
We're doing well in the path that I conceived, because our provocation talks a lot about linguist and cultural spaces, invisibilized subjects, encounters, disencounters. And we're talking about Pagu. She had a proletarian novel. She wrote proletarian novels. We have a beautiful Mozambique with a cross-eyed Z, proletarian poetry by Tatiana, which is incredible. You go from a place of reading poetry where poetry is like diaphanous, sublime, And you see Tatiana talking about a teacher has to clear the litter box, the cat's litter box, has to clean the litter box. These subjects that it's like I haven't talked much about them. So I would like for you all to talk about this ethic of this politics in your literature, which I see very present in dialogue, pagu, if you wish, or not. But what I think is that we can have in literature a weapon to struggle. This is part of our provocation that we receive these tools for our struggle. We see an instrumentalization, a very serious instrumentalization for political and economic purposes of language. I can see you doing this kind of literature. I think that here is where lies resistance. It was a well-designed word, but I think it's appropriate. I'd like for you to comment on this proletarian tone or vibe in your work. Perhaps I could do this touching on 2 points. First point is, at least in the Mozambican context, it is a mirage thinking of literature or any written document to do social activism or political activism because nobody reads the same things that spoken in a book or said in a book or even in a text, a 200-word article or chronicle. On television, broadcast on television or radio, the impact in Mozambique is totally different. At the level of dialogue that we have here is unthinkable in my country on books, because we would be talking about preaching to the converts, because the critical mass of people who read is very limited. So going back to the issue of statistics, today it's estimated that half of the country cannot read or write. And of those who do read and write, they don't read or write simply what they actually should, about what they should actually read and write. So it's an exercise, almost a dilettante exercise to write, thinking that nobody's going to read what you write. But I believe that the other dimension that interests me is that the process that we are traversing can be partly make this situation of exclusion become acute on chronic. I'll go back to the issue of the language. I said that the Portuguese language, although despite the 500 years of colonialism, is a relatively new process in historical terms in Mozambique. But with the economic liberalization, which is a new process from the late 1980s, Mozambique began gradually to transform many services that used to be public. They privatized them. At that time, the debate, even the intellectual debate, was in favor of transformation because they got confused with the rigidity, the single party's strict rules with the precarious public services. It's not always the same thing. But it so happens that with this liberalism, many schools, private schools, emerged, and these schools began to touch on an aspect which 20 years ago was unthinkable. Now it's virtually normal, taken for granted. It's to teach the entire curriculum in English. At the beginning of this process, the only people that had access to this were people with assets and the wealthy. The wealthy people, well-to-do people, but their differences in what it means to be well-to-do. There are differences. There's well-to-do and better-to-do. And Mozambique, whoever can have their children enrolled in private schools, and when they can afford it, in the best private schools, and even the ones that are not that good, have begun to teach in English. This fad. And why do I believe that this entails a huge risk of being exclusionary? First, because we're creating now a part of society which thinks they express themselves better than English in any other language because it's this contact that they have in school. But secondly, because if we consider the Portuguese language, the process of expansion of the Portuguese language in the territory is done to the detriment of the indigenous, the original African languages. People who have our African language, we call them national language. The national language is their first language. Oftentimes they speak Portuguese, but people who speak Portuguese as their first language oftentimes don't speak the national African languages. And if we consider the ones that are learning English as their first language, or the language that they have contact with in school, the situation is going to be even worse. So the essay proposed here is that in all societies, I would imagine the same in Brazil, whoever defines, it's the elites who decide what things are. The elites consist of politicians who are not politicians, they're businessmen, but there's no difference because the politicians want to be businessmen and the businessmen want to be politicians. And these kinds of individuals have their children enrolled in these schools, and these children are going to be our leaders in the near future. And if these individuals already have difficulty in expressing themselves in Portuguese, not to mention the African languages, it's not going to be very complicated for them to suggest that English be the national language. So, if almost 50 years of independence now in Mozambique, Portuguese language still is a language which is not spoken by most of the population, just imagine what may happen if they adopt, or we adopt, the English language, and fantastic arguments are not missing. But who's going to suffer? It's the Jolo, the character from my book. Unfortunately, literature is not the only mechanism in my country to debate intellectual topics or any other topics because people don't read, but the problems exist. Okay, I think that you talk, Manuel, about the issue of the elites, and from the point of view, there's a linguistic elite also, we could say, and I believe that there's also elite in poetry, the poetry elite. There's a literary elite as well. So I think for us to talk about our position here and problematize our position, it's necessary to touch on this topic. But notice that, I believe it, even this kind of diction or raise the issue of a possible resistance inside and the language of poetry. I think that the main challenge is for us to be able to make the poetic words circulate. And we know that from certain perspectives and angles, the publishing universe and that of publications in Brazil, it is limited. And this limitation relates to certain positions, elitist positions oftentimes. So I believe, of course, Tatiana, here I am at Flip. It's beautiful, perfect, but my books have hardly reached here. My books have hardly reached, and they've come poorly, and they hardly came. They came hardly, and they hardly came to play on words. I have my 5th book of poetry. It's going to be published. It's supposed to be launched now, but I don't even know it's going to be launched because I haven't seen it myself. My publisher, the 2nd edition, is here, Octavio. I didn't have the 2nd edition, which Nanni has the 2nd edition, but that's kind of the issue. It's a position, it's kind of a haphazard stance that I find myself in. Thank you very much to my publisher. I'm in a precarious position. As a professor of literature, this issue of having the words circulate and to mobilize these discussions, to be able to also mobilize these transits and circuits between in the southeast of Brazil. It's necessary. Between Milena and Fernanda gave a special shape and contour to this festival. I think you're beautifully to be congratulated because of subverted and transgressed this axis which sustains, in a sense, in one way or another, this elite, this literary canon and publishing canon. It is a huge challenge. But just to pick up on another point, I think that it speaks to the political issue that Manuel touched on, and he circulates in. I think myself that it's a lesser issue. What I do, we pay for our analysts for that purpose to deal with my last name is Pequeno, which means small. Like Clarice Lispector said, what I write is actually a lesser art. What appears in my poetry is the voice of my grandmother, the voice of my father who died in a bizarre situation. It's the voice of women who were never loved, the voice of people who have become precarious, people that have become vulnerable. They're still vulnerable. We know that certain positions don't prevent prejudice and discrimination and stigma and violence to occur and to be underrated. And what I think do is a lesser art and fine. I pay my analysts to work through that one way or another. I'm going to pick up on that point to ask for a round of applause for the curators, Fernanda and Milena. Fernanda, Milena, thank you for the bombs, right? Tatiana's book is called "Where Are the Bombs?" A question mark, without the question mark, rather. Where the bombs are. Another year where you've managed to do what Tatiana was commenting. I'm going to talking about this book. We had already agreed to talk more about the topics, perhaps less about the books for people who haven't read them. Okay, to be left in the dark, but I'm certain that no matter we give a spoiler, you're still going to want to read the books because the language is worth it, the experience with the reading. This book, Where the Bombs Are, was published in 2009, and it reclaims a number of things. I did a timeline here, which we experienced in Brazil from 2013 with the demonstrations, which led to everything that we experienced. After them, we experienced in 2016 a coup, which impeached legitimately elected president, woman, in prison of a candidate in 2017. He was the favorite for the election. In the following year, done in backhanded ways by a politician who was benefited by this election. In 2018, we lost Marielle Franco because of all this political conspiracy. 2019 was the first year in the administration in 2019. That was the year this book was published. So I think that I disagree with Tatiana. I would like for you to comment on how you wrote Where Are the Bombs? It's happening. I was happening with this session, this panel, not just for the opportunity to meet Manuel, to bring this book back from 2019 to talk about him, to be able to see it re-edited. Congratulations for the new edition. Congratulations to the publisher. It's great that we have this book back again, picking up on this timeline. Tell us a little bit more about this book, where the bombs are. Okay.
It's a very special book, and I'm very glad that the second edition was done. We have 3 extra poems. I guess 2019 was specifically was the last time I came to Flip, actually, for the launch of that book. And this is something that is very current, actually. It will mirror something that is not yet dissipated, that is still there, lurking behind us. The last one I read was, I'm alive, but I don't know to which corner I will be living. So things did change, but, in real terms, we are a country that is brutal, a country, political country. We are a country constituted by a history of violence and cruelty that still is here, right around. Just, turn every corner and you will see it. You don't have to go very far to see it. And so I feel very sensitive to the idea that this book still makes sense. I feel moved to the fact that this book still has this dimension of being current, of being that, it has also, thanks to the work of Macondo and Otávio, my editor, who worked with this book, with my work, and thanks to Social Network also, which in one way or the other welcomed in a certain way something of my book. If you allow me, can I read a poem? There's this part that said, what could truly be a peaceful vision, dignified, that would be signified by a violent. And so it is in memory, and I'm going to read. I'll go through it fast. Until I was 16, I lived in obsolete and high building in the heart of an avenue called Brazil. The city was calling part of their neighborhood with the nickname that is ironically cruel, known as Gaza Strip. I was made up of wars, women's, and the armed nation. Faixa de Gaza, Gaza Strip. At that time, I thought the territory was sick and it needed band-aids, or which was also true. But my baptism was by the exception, because I was a local from a place that you die and you kill, a place that is archaic with pus and violence. It was a faithful portrait of the faithful territory in which I was, to which I was born to. I'm not sure if I answered. I did my best. I guess the poem will. Yes, I could read it forever. I would like to remind you, of course, that you can participate and send in your questions in writing. If you want to, if you have any questions to our authors, we have some time to talk about your questions. So please, so just send it to us. Not only this book, Manuel, but your literary production generally. So you're working now on another material that has more of a historical backdrop. Actually, I forgot to ask you if I could talk about it. But maybe if you could share with us, what are you working on? The material that is now being prepared, so to speak, it's not worth, to talk about it right now. It's still to be published in the press, so to speak. So maybe I'm the first adventure in this whole thing about writing, about being an author and literature. And this is maybe a satire. I called it Visão in Portuguese. And it is based on something that is very Mozambican, and maybe countries with the same features as mine. Mozambique before being Mozambique and Mozambique now, it depends on alliances and it depends on support and help. And it seems to me it's interesting, and I talk about this in this book called Vision, and I talk about how this aid gained its own life, its own structure, and now it will try to perpetuate its existence in the sense that we use it to solve a certain issue. But if this process of benefiting something will benefit ourselves, it is no longer, the problem is no longer in our interest. The disappearance of the problem is no longer in our focus, in our horizon. So this is the, so to speak, helping to development, the aid to development. So my literature is not purely artistic, and it's not, it's a way of looking into the issues, things that I observe, and then as a narrative, I will try to talk about these issues and something that will be a pleasure, will be pleasing, and that will help people question things that that they didn't see, things that they didn't see as an issue before. So without wanting to really refer to the story of the book Vision, this is approximately what I refer to. I was also introduced here in Brazil in 2018, I guess, maybe another fair, not as sophisticated as Flip, but it was in Poços de Caldas in the state of Minas Gerais. And I hope eventually maybe to go back in the next years. I have my publishing house here, my editor here. And I hope to be here to present in this or another context the book that is still in the press. That hasn't a title, doesn't have a form, it has nothing. But it's something I'm fascinated with. And this is my what my editor also wishes me to do. Oh, so we have a couple of questions, great questions actually. Let me see which one I'm going to ask first. So this may be for both of you. Not only you write in Portuguese, you also write in, do you write in any other language? If you do, what is the difference in terms of what you say depending on the language? No, I only write in Portuguese. That's my only language. In my work, my daily work, my bread and butter, which is different from literature, I write 90% in English, 10% in Portuguese. So, but in literature, I only write in Portuguese. And the question was first by Celia, and this one is by Augustus. So poetry will make feelings blossom. And but the linguistic barrier or obstacle can be overcome by so poetries will bring about emotions and feelings, but are we able to overcome the barrier by the individuals that are awakened by poetries? Does your work really awaken your readers? I'm not sure I understand exactly what was the point of the question, but and I don't know how can poetry reach another person's ears. I write, I sometimes hesitate. My writing is born of bewilderment. I was always someone very uneasy, so to speak. So I'm not sure how this will reach my readers, but in a literary theory for receiving, for another person to minimally welcome what I write, you have to find in whatever I write something of him or herself. And I know that any type of process is quite delicate. It's we have this intersubjective exchanges. But I know that I am not a person that is very likable because I am a lesbian, fat woman from the outskirts of Rio. So it's not exactly something that people are very empathetic with. So there's lots of resistance to what I do as a poetry because of who I am. But what can I do about it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I can. But I will continue to do poetry because it's what I know and can do. I'm not sure who this question is addressed to. So what is your opinion regarding the Portuguese language? And is it possible to have a non-colonial Portuguese? I guess this is more for Manuel. Lusophony, or the Portuguese-speaking countries, is a community. And the fact that I'm here from Mozambique, and you're able to read, and we can all speak the same language, this is something very interesting. But there are some contradictions also, and actually many contradictions. The first one is, in this community, there are two norms. Portuguese is maybe we have the so-called continental Portuguese and the Brazilian Portuguese, Portugal and Brazil. And then you have Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, Saint Thomas and Prince, and Guinea-Bissau. I don't know which Portuguese we speak, actually. This is the first contradiction. So Portuguese is richer than what we do in Portugal or Brazil. Another interesting aspect is that because of other geographies, Luso is Portuguese. Everything that is Luso is Portugal. But because of Brazil, because of the African countries of Portuguese language, is that Portuguese has this global presence and expression that it has. So I'm not sure if Lusophony is the adequate name for this community, because in terms of numbers, only you here in Brazil would be more than 200 million Portuguese speakers, and another 10, 20 from Portugal. So, but we had to have a name, right? So we're not, when we talk about the Lusophonous community, Portuguese-speaking community. Another aspect with what I said is that this community is richer if they do recognize that there are underlying many other languages, many other dialects, and these languages are just enriching and feeding the Portuguese language. Words like machimbombo, machamba. Today, in our the dictionary Porto Editora, one of the let's say one of the main dictionaries, at least for Portuguese, continental Portuguese, these words are already included, and they came to the Portuguese language because of the African Mozambican experience, because of the Angolan experience. So it's important to recognize that the Portuguese-speaking world is not just Portuguese; it's a little bit more than that. Thank you. Just a word about this, if you allow me. Mia Couto has an amazing text called Lusoafonias. It's like an essay where he will put into context this whole issue of the pact, this pact that is supposedly peaceful, of a linguistic community surrounding the Portuguese language. And he will say some amazing things. But above all, he will talk about he will really go down to the detail that Portuguese language is not unanimous, especially in Africa, Right. And it's as if we're doing a nonfiction roundtable here. We're talking about linguistics and language. We talk about novels, poetry, to talk about everything. And the next question also will go in this sense. These are sources. Manuel's book is an amazing source to really think about and get to know these different expressions and authors. And the next question is, how do you, Manuel, assess or think about the publication of writers, men and women from Mozambique and other countries of Africa in Brazil? How do you see their publications here in Brazil? I guess Brazil eventually is the country that most gave the greatest steps for and space for the Mozambican writers. There is even Mozambican writers that are better known in Brazil than in Mozambique. And this is probably, for some factors, one of them that I cannot ignore is the fact that you were here in your publishing market. It was small and this and that. But if you compare this to our literature, to our market, there's no comparison. The fact that you have here the editorial industry, a publishing industry that is more developed, more advanced, the fact that you do not look to the Portuguese language and with all these rules and structures also opens a greater window for Mozambican writers, from African writers in general, and a space that in a literature that will use, such as the literature from Portugal, the space there is a bit more closed for African writers. So Brazil has been a very good platform for disclosing the work of writers around the world, but also bringing back to Mozambique, which is quite interesting. After this experience, certainly there will be in the Mozambican press, Manuel was in Brazil, and then all of a sudden, I will be interesting also in Mozambique. So it has been a very positive relation with the Brazilian market, and historically and culturally also. The miscegenation that we have with Mozambique. Mozambique is a country which has different traits, different historical connections with the Persians, with Arabs, with Europeans, including Portuguese, Brits, among others. And then our heritage, our African heritage, which is not unique, it's not a single heritage, and it will have different influences, different African influences, will make this country more recognizable, so to speak, for the Brazilian experience, because we also have this heritage, we also have this cultural wealth, and also in Portuguese. And I do like Portugal, and please do not misunderstand me, but the way that I speak Portuguese is probably closer to Portuguese than the way you speak. So all this wealth, cultural wealth, is interesting to all of us. And I was saying in the beginning, if you remember, that people and the peoples that have languages that are with not the very big global footprint. If you take Brazil out of the story of the language, the Portuguese language, there will be a lack of expression. And we are a country that speaks many languages. As I said, we had people speaking 2, 3, 4 languages, and I'm talking about African languages, but also many languages that are non-African. And there are many Mozambicans that speak Spanish because of historical process through which during the building of the Mozambican state, many people were sent to Cuba to study. And also because of the historical, many people went to Europe, to East Europe. And so people speak Russian. There are people who speak Ukrainian, and of course also English. We have a border with all English-speaking countries, at least officially, beyond their local languages. So everything is like this melting pot. And going back to the question you raised, Brazil, it seems to be one of these spaces in which it makes more sense for our historical and cultural experience. we are reaching the end of this table, of this event. Thank you so much for your questions. I guess you can notice that it is so important to read Manuel's literature, Tatiana's literature, and I guess, oh my God, it's so much better than what I expect. Thank you for the challenge, my dear curators. And they will be shortly at the Flip bookshop, signing their books. Please come and visit us. And thank you so much for coming.